The moment someone hurts you, something inside you reacts almost instantly. Your chest tightens, your mind starts racing, and before you even realize it, you're already forming a response. You want to explain, to correct, to make them understand exactly what they did. It feels natural. It feels justified. But hidden inside that moment is something far more important than the situation itself. The second your reaction becomes predictable, it becomes controllable. And that's where everything begins to shift. So the instinct is to move toward the noise, to argue, to chase clarity, to demand closure. But what if strength isn't found in expression, but in restraint? What if the real power isn't proving your worth, but refusing to place it in someone else's hands at all? Stoicism offers something simple, but difficult. You don't control what happens, but you control how deeply it reaches you. And once you understand that, something changes. Your silence is no longer empty. It becomes intentional. Not avoidance, not weakness, but control. The kind that doesn't need to be seen, because it's felt in the way you choose not to react. Think about the last time someone hurt you. Not just what they did, but how you reacted. The moment itself might fade, but the reaction stays. The replaying, the overthinking, the quiet conversations you keep having in your head long after everything is over. It's rarely just the event that lingers. It's how deeply it pulled you in. That urge to respond, to explain, to make them understand. It feels automatic, like something takes over before you even get a chance to pause. And in that moment, it feels justified. It feels necessary. But if you slow it down, something becomes clear. The urgency isn't coming from clarity, it's coming from emotion. And emotion in that state is loud, but not always truthful. It convinces you that you need to act now, that silence means weakness, that if you don't respond immediately, you're losing. But the Stoics saw this differently. They understood that the first reaction is rarely the right one. It's just the fastest one, driven by ego, by hurt, by the need to regain control. But reacting in that state doesn't restore control, it gives it away. Because once someone can predict your reaction, they can influence it. Your response becomes part of a pattern, and patterns are easy to read. This is where people lose something without noticing. Not loudly, not dramatically, subtly. Every reaction reveals something. What unsettles you, what triggers you, what pulls you off balance. And once that becomes visible, it becomes usable. Not always intentionally, but the dynamic shifts. One side reacts, the other observes. One side is emotional, the other becomes stable by default. And just like that, the balance is gone. The Stoics never tried to remove emotion, they refused to be ruled by it. Because when emotion takes over, your awareness narrows. Everything collapses into that moment. No perspective, no distance, no intention, just reaction. And reaction always ties you to something external. Something outside of you is now dictating your internal state. That's the part most people miss. It's not just about what you say or do. It's about what is controlling you when you say it. The shift is simple, but not easy. Instead of asking what happened, you ask what is in your control right now. And the answer is always the same. Your thoughts, your interpretation, your response. Not them, not their actions, not their intentions, just you. And that doesn't limit you, it grounds you. Because when you stop trying to control everything else, you finally gain control over yourself. And that's where stability begins. Not in changing others, but in mastering how you respond to them. That's why discipline matters. Not suppression, not silence out of fear, but space. Space between what you feel and what you do. Because in that space, you are no longer reacting, you are choosing. And over time, that choice changes everything. You become harder to provoke, harder to read. Not because you're hiding, but because you're no longer predictable in the ways that weaken you. You stop feeding patterns that once controlled you, and you start moving with intention instead of impulse. And if you're someone who wants to build that kind of control, to think more clearly, to react less impulsively, and to move through life with more discipline and self-respect, then subscribing isn't just following a channel, it's a decision to become someone who is harder to disturb, harder to control, and more grounded in who they are. What begins to shift when you adopt this mindset is subtle but powerful. You stop seeing every situation as something that demands a response. You start recognizing that not every action deserves your energy. And more importantly, not every feeling deserves immediate expression. That doesn't make you distant or cold. It makes you intentional. It means your actions are no longer driven by impulse, but by choice. And choice is where power exists. Over time, this changes how you experience situations entirely. You're no longer caught in the same cycles of reaction. You don't replay conversations in your head as often. You don't feel the same need to prove, to explain, to justify. Not because you don't care, but because you've realized that your peace is not something to negotiate. It's something to protect. And protecting it starts with understanding that your response is yours to control, no matter what happens around you. So what happens when you pause instead? Not a forced pause, not the kind where you're holding everything in while your mind is still racing, but a real pause. The kind where you step back internally and choose not to move immediately. At first, it feels unnatural, almost uncomfortable, because you're interrupting a pattern that has likely been running for years. The urge to react is still there, the thoughts are still forming, the emotions are still present, but you don't act on them right away. And in that space, something subtle begins to change. The intensity that once felt overwhelming starts to lose its grip. Not because the situation has changed, but because your relationship to it has. That space you create, even if it's only a few moments, is where control begins to return. Not control over the situation, but control over yourself. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Because when you're reacting instantly, you're not choosing your response, you're releasing it. You're letting whatever rises to the surface dictate your behavior. But when you pause, you introduce awareness. You start to see the reaction before it happens. You notice the impulse instead of becoming it. And once you can see it, you are no longer completely bound by it. This is where silence enters the picture, not as an absence but as a presence. A deliberate choice not to engage in the usual way, and that kind of silence carries weight. It's not empty, it's intentional. It communicates something without needing explanation. Most people are used to noise when conflict arises, raised voices, long messages, repeated attempts to clarify or defend. That's the pattern. That's what's expected. So when that pattern is suddenly broken, it creates a kind of tension that words cannot replicate. Not aggressive tension, but uncertainty. And uncertainty has a way of making people reflect in ways they normally wouldn't. The common misunderstanding is that silence equals indifference. That if you're not reacting, you must not care. But the reality is often the opposite. It takes far more effort to remain composed than it does to react emotionally. Reacting is immediate. It's instinctive. It requires no discipline. But choosing silence, especially when you feel justified in speaking, requires restraint. It requires clarity. It requires you to prioritize your state over your impulse. And that's not weakness. That's control in its most refined form. When you choose not to explain yourself in the heat of the moment, something interesting happens. You remove yourself from the emotional exchange. You're no longer feeding the cycle, and without that energy, the dynamic shifts. Because most interactions rely on mutual participation. One person says something, the other responds, and the exchange continues. But when one side steps out of that loop, the rhythm is disrupted, and in that disruption, the other person is left without the reaction they anticipated. They're left to sit with what they said or did without immediate feedback. And that often creates more reflection than any argument ever could. It's not about ignoring or avoiding. That's where people get it wrong. Avoidance comes from fear. Silence, when chosen with intention, comes from strength. You're not running from the situation. You're refusing to engage with it in a way that compromises your clarity. You're giving yourself time to process, to understand, to decide whether engagement is even necessary. And sometimes, the more time you give it, the less necessary it becomes. What once felt urgent starts to feel optional. What once felt like something you had to address immediately begins to lose its weight. There's also a shift in how you are perceived, though that's not the primary goal. When you don't react the way people expect, it challenges their assumptions. They can't easily categorize your response because it doesn't follow the usual pattern. And that unpredictability, not in a chaotic sense but in a controlled one, changes how the interaction unfolds. It's no longer about pulling a reaction out of you. That door is closed. And when that door is closed, the entire dynamic has to adjust. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak. A principle often associated with Epictetus reflects this idea in a deeper way. It's not just about listening to others, but about listening to yourself before you speak. Observing your thoughts, your emotions, your impulses, and allowing them to settle before you decide what to do with them. Because what you say in the heat of the moment often reflects your reaction, not your intention, and those are rarely aligned. As you practice this, something else begins to happen. You start to feel less pulled into situations that once consumed you. Not because you don't notice them, but because they no longer have the same hold on your attention. You're not as quick to engage, not as quick to respond, not as quick to internalize, and that creates a sense of distance, not emotional detachment in a cold or disconnected way, but a grounded distance that allows you to remain steady, even when things around you are not. Over time, this becomes less of a conscious effort and more of a natural response. The pause becomes automatic. The silence becomes comfortable. And with that comes a kind of quiet confidence. You don't feel the same need to assert yourself in every situation. You don't feel the same urgency to be understood immediately. You're willing to let things unfold without forcing an outcome, and that willingness changes how you move through conflict entirely. What once felt like something that demanded your attention now becomes something you can observe without being consumed by it. And in that shift, you gain something far more valuable than being right or being heard in a moment of tension. You gain control over how deeply anything affects you, and that control, once developed, becomes one of the most powerful tools you can carry. Now imagine this clearly, almost like you're stepping back into a familiar situation, but choosing a completely different path this time. Someone says something that would normally trigger you. Maybe it's dismissive, maybe it's disrespectful, maybe it hits something personal. In the past, that moment would have pulled you in instantly. Your mind would start forming responses before they even finish speaking. Your body would tighten, your tone would shift, and the entire interaction would begin to move in a predictable direction. But this time, something is different. You don't rush. You don't match their energy. You stay composed, not distant, not cold, just steady. And in that steadiness, the entire dynamic begins to shift in ways that are almost invisible at first, but deeply powerful. You acknowledge what needs to be acknowledged, nothing more, nothing less. There is no over-explaining, no emotional overflow, no attempt to make them fully understand you in that moment. You respond with clarity, with precision, and then you stop. You don't chase the conversation further than it needs to go. You don't try to force resolution or closure from someone who may not even be capable of giving it. And that restraint, that quiet control, does something unexpected. It removes the script they were prepared to follow. Because whether people realize it or not, most interactions operate on patterns. Someone provokes, the other reacts, and from there the situation escalates. It's almost mechanical, predictable. And because it's predictable, it's easy to navigate, easy to control. But when you step out of that pattern, when you refuse to play your expected role, the structure breaks. There is no escalation because there is nothing feeding it. There is no back and forth because you are not engaging in it the same way. And that creates a kind of silence, not the absence of words, but the absence of predictability. And that's where uncertainty enters. Not confusion in a chaotic sense, but a pause in the other person's expectations. They anticipated a certain version of you, a familiar reaction, a known response. And instead, they are met with something they can't easily read, something controlled, something measured. And in that moment, the focus shifts. It is no longer about pulling you into the interaction. It becomes about understanding why you didn't move the way they expected. This is where reflection begins, not because you forced it, not because you explained anything in detail, but because the usual pattern was interrupted. People are used to reacting environments. They move based on feedback. They say something, they expect something in return. And when that return doesn't come in the expected form, it creates a gap. A space where they have to sit with their own words, their own actions, without immediate reinforcement. And that space is often more impactful than any argument could ever be, because arguments tend to keep both sides locked in their positions, each person trying to prove a point, defend a perspective, or win in some way. But when there is no argument, there is nothing to push against, and without resistance, the mind often turns inward. There is a quiet discipline in being able to do this. It's not about suppressing what you feel. The feeling is still there. You're still aware of what was said, what was done, and how it affected you. But instead of letting that feeling dictate your behavior, you let your principles guide you. You decide that your response will align with who you are trying to become, not just how you feel in that moment. And that decision, repeated over time, builds a kind of internal consistency. You begin to trust yourself more, because you know you are not easily pulled into reactions that you later regret. You know that your actions come from a place of clarity, not impulse. This doesn't mean every situation becomes easy. There are still moments where the urge to react feels strong, moments where staying composed feels like effort. But the more you practice this, the more natural it becomes. The gap between stimulus and response grows, and in that gap you gain freedom. Freedom to choose, freedom to step back, freedom to not engage in something that does not serve you, and that freedom changes how you experience interactions entirely. You are no longer at the mercy of what others say or do. You are grounded in how you choose to respond. Any person capable of angering you becomes your master, as Epictetus observed, and that idea becomes very real in moments like this. Because when someone can predict your reaction, when they can provoke you into responding in a certain way, they are influencing your behavior without effort. But the moment you break that pattern, the moment your response is no longer automatic, that influence weakens. You are no longer reacting to them, you are acting from yourself. And that shift, though subtle, changes everything. Over time, this approach reshapes not just how others perceive you, but how you perceive yourself. You begin to see yourself as someone who is not easily shaken, not easily drawn into unnecessary conflict. Someone who can engage when it is meaningful, and step back when it is not. And that clarity reduces a lot of the noise that usually surrounds these situations. You're not constantly replaying conversations, not constantly wondering what you should have said or done differently, because you know that your response was intentional, not reactive. There is also a deeper layer to this that becomes more apparent with time. When you stop engaging in predictable patterns, you stop reinforcing dynamics that don't serve you. You are no longer participating in cycles that lead to the same outcomes over and over again, and that creates space for different kinds of interactions, ones that are based on mutual respect, clarity, and understanding, rather than reaction and escalation. It doesn't mean every situation improves, but it means you are no longer contributing to patterns that keep you stuck. And in that, something important settles within you. A sense of stability. Not because everything around you is controlled, but because you are. Your response is no longer something that can be easily anticipated or influenced. It is something you choose. And when your actions come from that place, they carry a different kind of weight. Not loud, not forceful, but steady. And that steadiness is often more powerful than any reaction could ever be. This is where most people get it wrong. The idea of confusing someone is often misunderstood, almost reduced to something shallow. People hear that and immediately think about tactics, about playing games, about creating mixed signals, or acting in a way that keeps the other person guessing. But that's not what this is, not even close. Because anything that is forced, anything that is calculated purely to manipulate, eventually reveals itself. It lacks stability, it lacks authenticity, and more importantly, it keeps you tied to the very dynamic you're trying to escape. Real confusion, the kind that actually shifts things, doesn't come from trying to control someone else's perception. It comes from becoming someone who no longer reacts in predictable ways. When your behavior is no longer driven by impulse, it becomes harder to read. Not because you're hiding anything, but because you're no longer operating on the same emotional level. Most interactions are built on patterns that people unconsciously rely on. Someone pushes, you respond. Someone withdraws, you chase. Someone creates tension, you try to resolve it. These patterns repeat because they're familiar. They feel natural, even when they're unhealthy. But when you step out of that cycle, when your response no longer follows the expected path, it creates something unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity is often interpreted as unpredictability. That unpredictability is not chaos, it's control. It's the result of someone who is no longer reacting automatically, but choosing deliberately. And when your actions come from that place, they carry a different kind of presence. You're not trying to be understood in every moment. You're not trying to manage how others perceive you. You're simply grounded in your own clarity, and that grounding creates distance. Not just physical distance, but psychological distance. The kind of distance where someone can no longer access you in the same way they used to. They can't trigger the same reactions. They can't rely on the same patterns. And because of that, the entire dynamic changes. Most people don't realize how much of their behavior is accessible to others. Not in an obvious sense, but in subtle ways. The way they respond to certain words, the way they react under pressure, the way they seek validation or reassurance. These patterns become visible over time, and once they are visible, they can be anticipated. And once they can be anticipated, they can be influenced. Not always intentionally, but the effect is the same. You become part of a loop that others can navigate without much effort. And breaking that loop requires more than just changing what you say. It requires changing how you respond internally. This is where the shift begins to deepen. You stop asking how to respond in a way that affects them and start focusing on responding in a way that aligns with you. That might sound simple, but it changes everything. Because when your actions are no longer tied to their behavior, you become independent of the dynamic. You are no longer reacting to them. You are acting from yourself. And that independence is what creates real separation. Not distance for the sake of avoidance, but distance that comes from clarity. You know what you will and won't engage with. You know what deserves your energy and what doesn't. And that knowledge removes a lot of the noise that usually surrounds these interactions. Over time, this creates a version of you that is harder to categorize. Not because you're inconsistent, but because you're no longer predictable in the ways people expect. You don't react out of habit. You don't follow the same emotional scripts. And that makes your behavior less accessible. People can't easily anticipate how you'll respond, because your response is not based on their actions. It's based on your principles. And principles are not easily manipulated. They are stable, consistent, and internally driven. This kind of presence doesn't need to announce itself. It's felt. In the way you carry yourself, in the way you respond, in the way you choose when to engage and when to step back. There is a quiet confidence in it, not loud or performative, but steady. And that steadiness naturally changes how others interact with you. Not because you're trying to control them, but because you are no longer participating in the same patterns. The dynamic adjusts because it has to. The old ways of engaging no longer apply. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And that idea sits at the core of this shift. Most reactions are unconscious. They happen before you have the chance to examine them. They feel like who you are, when in reality they are patterns you've learned and repeated over time. But when you start bringing awareness to those patterns, when you start noticing them before acting on them, you interrupt that automatic cycle. And in that interruption, you gain choice. Real choice. That choice is what allows you to move differently, not in a way that is forced or artificial, but in a way that reflects awareness. You begin to see situations more clearly. You recognize when something is pulling you into a reaction that doesn't serve you, and instead of following it, you step back, not out of fear, but out of understanding. You realize that not every situation requires your participation. Not every interaction deserves your energy, and that realization alone creates a kind of freedom that most people never fully experience. As this continues, the way you relate to others shifts naturally. You're no longer seeking the same things. You're not as concerned with being validated, understood, or agreed with in every moment. You're more focused on staying aligned with yourself. And that alignment becomes the foundation of how you move. It becomes the standard by which you decide what to engage with and what to leave behind. And in that, something important settles. You are no longer easily pulled into dynamics that once controlled you. You are no longer reacting in ways that can be predicted or influenced. You are moving with intention, with clarity, with a sense of direction that comes from within. And that changes everything, not because others suddenly understand you better, but because you are no longer dependent on them to define your response. But here's the part that most people don't want to hear, even though it's the part that changes everything. This was never really about them. It might feel like it is. It might look like it is. Their actions, their words, the way they treated you, all of that feels like the center of the situation. But if you look closely, what keeps the situation alive isn't what they did. It's what you keep doing with it afterward. The replaying, the analyzing, the need to understand, the need to feel seen or acknowledged. That's where your energy goes. And wherever your energy goes, that's what grows. The Stoic perspective cuts through this in a way that can feel uncomfortable at first, because it removes the focus from them entirely. It doesn't ask whether they were right or wrong. It doesn't focus on whether they will regret what they did. It doesn't revolve around whether they will come back, apologize, or change. Instead, it turns everything inward, not in a self-blaming way, but in a self-directing way. It asks a different question altogether. Not what did they do, but what are you going to do with what happened? And that shift, as simple as it sounds, is where real power begins. Because when your focus stays on them, your energy stays tied to them. Even if they're no longer present, even if the situation is over, you're still connected through thought, through emotion, through the need for resolution. And that connection keeps you in the same place. It keeps you reacting internally, even if nothing is happening externally. That's why people often feel stuck long after something has ended, not because they can't move on, but because they haven't redirected their attention. They are still investing energy into something that no longer deserves it. When you begin to redirect that energy, everything starts to shift. Slowly at first, almost unnoticeable. Instead of replaying the situation, you begin to observe yourself, your patterns, your reactions, your tendencies. You start to see where you gave too much, where you ignored certain signs, where you allowed your peace to be dependent on someone else's behavior. Not to criticize yourself, but to understand. Because understanding creates awareness, and awareness creates change. That change doesn't happen all at once. It builds through small decisions. Choosing not to revisit the same thoughts over and over. Choosing not to check for updates, not to seek indirect validation, not to measure your worth based on someone else's actions. And each time you make that choice, you reclaim a little bit of your energy. You bring it back to yourself. And as that continues, you begin to feel something different. Not closure in the traditional sense, but distance. A quiet separation from what once felt consuming. This is where growth actually begins, not in the moment of being hurt, but in what you choose to do afterward. You start investing in things that strengthen you, your habits, your discipline, your mindset, not as a reaction, not as a way to prove anything, but as a way to build something stable within yourself. And over time, that stability becomes more valuable than any external validation ever was. Because it doesn't fluctuate based on how someone treats you. It doesn't depend on being understood or appreciated. It comes from knowing who you are and acting in alignment with that. There is a quiet shift that happens when you stop needing someone else to recognize your value. You no longer feel the urge to explain yourself in the same way. You don't feel the need to prove that you were right or that you deserved better. Not because those things aren't true, but because you no longer need them to be acknowledged externally. You've already accepted them internally, and that acceptance removes a lot of the tension that usually keeps people stuck. You're not waiting anymore, not for an apology, not for clarity, not for anything. No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself, as Seneca wrote, and that idea reframes the entire experience. What once felt like something that set you back begins to feel like something that revealed something important. Not about them, but about you. Your limits, your patterns, your capacity to grow beyond what you thought you could handle. And in that, the situation takes on a different meaning. It's no longer just something that happened to you. It becomes something that shaped you in a way that you can actually use. As this continues, your priorities begin to shift. You're less focused on what others are doing and more focused on what you are building. Your attention moves away from external noise and toward internal clarity. And that clarity simplifies things. You're not as easily pulled into situations that don't align with you. You don't feel the same need to engage in every conflict, to respond to every slight, to correct every misunderstanding. You become more selective, not in a distant or detached way, but in a grounded way. That groundedness is what makes this approach so effective. It's not about controlling outcomes or influencing how others feel. It's about becoming someone who is no longer easily influenced, someone who can experience something difficult without being defined by it. And that kind of strength doesn't come from avoiding pain. It comes from processing it, understanding it, and then choosing where your energy goes next. Over time, the need for validation fades. Not completely, but significantly. You no longer look to others to confirm your worth. You no longer depend on their behavior to determine how you feel about yourself. And that independence creates a kind of freedom that is hard to describe but easy to recognize once you feel it. You are no longer tied to outcomes in the same way. You are not waiting for things to resolve in order to feel at peace. You carry that peace with you, regardless of what others do. And when you reach that point, something becomes very clear. The situation that once felt like it had power over you no longer does. Not because it changed, but because you did. Your focus shifted, your energy moved, your perspective expanded. And in that shift, you didn't just move on from what happened. You moved beyond the version of yourself that would have stayed stuck in it. So what happens when you fully detach from the need to react, to prove, to be understood? At first, it doesn't feel like freedom. It feels unfamiliar, almost like something is missing. Because for so long, your responses were tied to what others did, what they said, how they behaved. There was always something to respond to, something to fix, something to explain. And now, without that constant pull, there's space. Quiet space. And most people don't realize how uncomfortable that can be in the beginning. Not because it's bad, but because it's new. You're no longer moving in reaction. You're no longer chasing resolution in the same way. And that absence of urgency can feel strange before it starts to feel powerful. But as that space settles, something begins to shift. You start to notice that you're not as affected by the same things anymore, not because you've become indifferent, but because you're no longer controlled by them. There's a difference between feeling something and being moved by it. Before, a situation would pull you in completely. Your thoughts, your mood, your focus would all revolve around it. Now you can see it without being consumed by it. You can acknowledge it without needing to act on it immediately. And that subtle difference changes everything, because control is no longer external, it's internal. This is where freedom actually begins to take shape. Not the kind of freedom that comes from everything going your way, but the kind that comes from knowing that your state is not dependent on what happens around you. You don't need things to resolve in a certain way to feel at peace. You don't need someone to understand you in order to feel validated. You don't need closure in the form you once thought you did. And that realization removes a lot of the pressure that usually drives people to react. You're no longer trying to control outcomes that were never fully in your control to begin with. There is also a shift in how you experience other people. When you're no longer seeking validation or reaction, your interactions become clearer. You see things as they are, not as you hope them to be. You're not projecting expectations or trying to guide the outcome. You're observing, engaging when it aligns, stepping back when it doesn't. And that clarity makes it easier to recognize what is worth your time and what isn't. You're no longer trying to make everything work. You're allowing things to reveal themselves. What's interesting is that this kind of detachment often creates a response in others, but not in the way people expect. It's not about making someone feel something directly. It's about removing the usual access they had to your reactions. And when that access is gone, it creates a kind of uncertainty. They may not understand it at first. They may expect you to eventually respond the way you used to. But when that doesn't happen, when the pattern is consistently absent, something shifts in their perception. Not because you explained it, but because your actions no longer match their expectations. That's where the deeper realization begins, not just for them, but for you as well. You start to see how much of your previous behavior was tied to patterns that were never questioned. You see how often you responded out of habit rather than intention. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You begin to move differently, not as an effort, but as a result of awareness. And that awareness creates a kind of stability that isn't easily disrupted. It's not something you have to force. It becomes natural. You start catching yourself before you fall into the same loops. You notice the impulse, but you don't immediately follow it. And in that small pause, you begin to understand just how much of your past reactions were automatic. There is only one way to happiness, and that is to cease worrying about things which are beyond the power of our will. A principle echoed by Epictetus captures this shift in a simple but profound way. Because once you truly understand what is and isn't within your control, a lot of the noise fades. You stop investing energy into outcomes you can't dictate. You stop trying to influence reactions that aren't yours to manage. And in doing so, you free up that energy for something more valuable. Yourself. Your thoughts become clearer. Your decisions become more deliberate. You're no longer scattered across situations that don't belong to you. You become centered. As this continues, the need to prove anything starts to dissolve. You're not trying to show your worth through reactions, through explanations, through effort directed at others. Your worth becomes something internal, something stable. And because of that, your actions become more selective. You engage where it matters. You step back where it doesn't. Not out of avoidance, but out of clarity. You're no longer pulled into every situation that presents itself. You choose. And that choice is no longer emotional. It's intentional. It reflects who you are becoming, not how you feel in a moment. That choice is what makes this approach so powerful. It's not loud. It doesn't draw attention to itself. There are no dramatic shifts, no visible declarations, but it's undeniable in its effect. Because when someone expects access to your emotions and finds none, when they expect a reaction and are met with composure, it creates a kind of distance that can't be easily bridged. Not because you're closing yourself off, but because you're no longer available in the same way. You're not participating in the same patterns, and without that participation, the connection changes. And that can be unsettling for people who were used to interacting with a different version of you. The version that reacted, that engaged, that participated in the same patterns. But this isn't about unsettling anyone. It's about no longer compromising your state for the sake of maintaining a dynamic that doesn't serve you. It's about recognizing that your peace is not something to be negotiated. It's something to be maintained. And once you take that seriously, your standards begin to shift. You become more aware of what you allow into your space, both externally and internally. Over time, this becomes your default. Not something you have to think about constantly, but something that naturally guides how you move. You don't feel the same pull to react. You don't feel the same need to explain. You're comfortable with being misunderstood if it means staying aligned with yourself, and that comfort removes a lot of the pressure that usually drives behavior. You're no longer performing for understanding. You're simply acting in alignment. And as this deepens, something else becomes clear. You begin to value your energy differently. You stop spending it on things that drain you without giving anything meaningful in return. You stop chasing conversations that lead nowhere. You stop trying to fix situations that were never yours to fix. And instead, you invest that energy into things that build you, your discipline, your habits, your mindset, your future, and that shift compounds over time. In the end, what you gain isn't just distance from certain situations or people. You gain a deeper connection to yourself, a sense of stability that isn't easily shaken. And from that place, everything else becomes clearer. You're no longer moving in response to what others do. You're moving in alignment with who you've become. Your decisions feel lighter, not because they matter less, but because they are no longer weighed down by the need for approval or validation. You trust your judgment more. You rely less on external signals to tell you how to feel or what to do. And that changes the way you experience everything. Situations that once felt overwhelming begin to feel manageable. Interactions that once pulled you in no longer have the same effect. You still feel, you still care, but you're no longer controlled. There's a quiet confidence in that. Not loud, not performative, but steady. And that steadiness becomes your foundation. And that's a level of freedom most people don't reach, not because it's impossible, but because it requires letting go of the need to control what was never truly theirs to control in the first place. At some point, you realize the real power was never in reacting. It was in choosing not to. Not because you don't feel, but because you've learned not to be ruled by what you feel. And once you reach that place where your peace is no longer negotiable, where your worth is no longer dependent on anyone else, you don't just move differently. You become untouchable in a way most people don't understand. If this resonated with you, there's another video on your screen right now that will take this even deeper and help you strengthen that mindset. Watch it next, and thank you for being part of Stoic Journal.